not what Lee Harvey Oswald looks like at all. He's not looking like a politicized sociopath. He's not looking like someone who, I just did something extraordinary. I finally made something big out of my life, y'all. Look at me. I did it. I'm proud of what I've done. That's not the picture of who is standing there in front of the fleet of reporters. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and this is the fourth of 4 series of chats about a documentary involving Ruth Paine and the JFK assassination. And it's been fascinating. I hope you guys have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. This one's going to wrap it up, and this one is the one where we get modern day Ruth Paine. Max Good, the documentarian, actually lived like 40 minutes from Ruth Paine and reached out to her for this documentary, and she participated. So for those who have said that this is just a smear job, one of the things I'd ask you to consider is that he's been very fair to her, using tons of footage of her own words throughout this documentary. And not only that, but she participated in the documentary. So let's get into it and talk about what she had to say. The first thing that I thought was funny is that he says it's reached the point in his research where he knows he has to sit down with her and ask some hard questions. He says to let her story go unchallenged would be a disservice to history. When he sits down with her and says, I knew I needed to ask you some things. I've been doing some reading and I've got some hard questions for you. She says, oh, shoot. Which is just so cute. She's kind of this grandmotherly figure at this point in the documentary. She's got, for example, a red turtleneck with a little black embroidered type vest, or, she's looking very grandmotherly. And so she is a sweet older woman, but she's in full possession of her mind, and she's very clear and calculating in her speech, even in this. So this is definitely not taking advantage of someone who is losing their faculties. In fact, he was very respectful to Michael Paine when it was clear that his memory was going. He gave a very quick little blip of Michael Paine in his older years. But Ruth, he talks to specifically. And he asks her about, first of all, there's this interesting part where we're given information that Ruth and Michael Paine had a call immediately after the assassination. There's a call between Ruth and Michael Paine, and the FBI was monitoring them. And the quote is that they knew Lee Harvey Oswald was not the one responsible. And quote, we both know who is responsible, end quote. Now, she, in her questioning, chalks that up as, oh yeah, we just thought, we think we know who is responsible. We think it's people who hate Kennedy. But as the story became clear, so that's how she writes it off. But that is not how it reads. When you read the text, it does not read that way at all. He asks her about her family's hostility to communism. He notes that her sister, Sylvia Hoke, has been in the CIA since 1954. And once he shows her documents, she had previously poo-pooed that idea and said, oh no, I don't think she was ever CIA. Well, now that he shows her documents where there are tax filings, there are job descriptions, she says, well, yeah, I suppose she could have been CIA. And then he points out that Ruth Paine's dad, when he did reports for the AID, the US AID, his reports were directly sent to the CIA. She still says, no, I don't think he ever did CIA work. He asks, well, wasn't this the case back in this era that the CIA would recruit whole families? And she kind of blinks and says, whole families? And he's like, yeah. And he says, he gives us the backstory. You might remember that in the summer of 1963, she went up to Naushon Island. She was supposedly separated from her husband, Michael. Now, I will say they reunited real quick, I think in December of 1963, right after the assassination. But In the summer of 1963, she went up to his family's island, Noshawn Island, which, just a little plug, it's like literally, I'll show you the map, right there beside Chappaquiddick Island, very nearby. Noshawn Island is owned by the Forbes family, and she spent the entire summer there. Then she goes to D.C. to visit with her sister. And then she goes on to pick up Marina in New Orleans and get all their worldly goods, is how she calls it, and bring Marina up with her to Dallas. That September is also when Oswald supposedly goes to Mexico City, but remember, not really. It's not actually Oswald. And October is when he gets the job at the book depository. 5 weeks later, the president is dead. So that's the timeline of events here. And she also says, well, while you're at it, I'll just go ahead and throw out that, my mother-in-law was the best friend of Mary Bancroft, which Mary Bancroft was Allen Dulles's mistress. I'll let that sink in for a minute. Allen Dulles is the man, you remember, that JFK had fired from being the head of the CIA. His mistress, Mary Bancroft, was Michael Paine's mother's best friend. And she often spent time there on that island. In fact, she spent the summer of 1963 on Noshawn Island. So we have a very close connection between Ruth Paine and Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles, who JFK had fired, who ends up on the Warren Commission. She says, well, my family was concerned about the world, and she uses this term, we forget about noblesse oblige. The idea that if you're a wealthy person with resources, that you're obligated to use those for the good of others. The researcher Bill Simpich makes this very convincing argument, I think. He says, you'll never find a piece of paper. They weren't formally hired, is what he believes. He says, but I believe they'd do little favors out of patriotism, that they were in a position to do so. Now, she is brought in to talk about the money that Michael Paine's family has, and she kind of dismisses it and doesn't want to get into any particulars, but she says, yes, there's a family fund, and he gets money from this fund, and yes, that does supply, his life, but he always felt that he was obligated to help others. He never felt like he thought, since this money came to him without his work, that he should use it to bless others. So that's the picture being presented. Not necessarily that if you go to the CIA real, HR files, that you're going to find Ruth and Michael Paine there, although I would say maybe you would. But the argument being made here is not that they were for sure CIA hires, but that they were most certainly in the circles of these things, and that they were influenceable, that they might be willing to do certain things out of patriotism. In September, Marina moves in, and now we're being given the psychologizing of Lee Oswald. Max Holland, who is a reporter that he wrote an article for the CIA's website, and so some people think that he is CIA, but he says that Lee Harvey Oswald was a politicized sociopath. That's quite a big accusation. He had that kind of mentality. He said, life has been tough and I've got to get out there, and that's his presentation of what Lee Harvey Oswald was like. And Ruth Paine says that he did it to be extraordinary, that he was a small man who wanted to be great, wanted to do something extraordinary. Michael Paine is quoted as saying he was proud of what he had done, that he really thought it was great that he had killed the president. Now, we're brought back then to the days following the assassination when Lee Oswald was in custody. His own comments were not at all proud of it, not at all taking credit for it. In fact, saying the opposite, that he had nothing to do with it, he hadn't been accused of it, he was a patsy. This is not the actions of someone who is either stunned, like you think about some of the school shooters that are taken in and their first photos are like they're high on whatever psychotropic meds they're on, and also in the shock of the moment of having done it. That's not what Lee Harvey Oswald looks like at all. He's not looking like a politicized sociopath. He's not looking like someone who, I just did something extraordinary. I finally made something big out of my life, y'all. Look at me. I did it. I'm proud of what I've done. That's not the picture of who is standing there in front of the fleet of reporters. He says, I haven't been accused of that. The only reason they've accused me of that is that I lived in the USSR for a while. But he's not proud of it. Max Good reminds us, Lee Oswald was a communist in Dallas. He was a proud communist. But all of his friends are fierce anti-communists, white Russians, who had every reason not to be glad about communism, or they're connected to the CIA. His group of friends doesn't seem to fit who he was at all. And so we're left with the question of, was he himself CIA? We talked about that a bit in the last episode. Was he a fake defector? Was he not actually wanting to go to the USSR to live there for the rest of his life? I mean, obviously he wasn't, because he came back. But the real question is, was he still in intelligence, just like he had been in the USSR? Was he now in Dallas in intelligence, seeking to gain access and information on radical groups? He and Michael Paine were going to all of these different groups, seeking out information, apparently, potentially for Michael Paine, about Cuban sympathizers. Was Lee Oswald a part of that? He is now, just like he was gaining information potentially about the KGB, is he now gaining information about other groups in New Orleans and in Dallas? Is that part of what he was doing? It seems so. Max Good takes us to Jack Ruby and shares some very cryptic comments that Ruby made in his final days. We may do another deep dive at some point on Jack Ruby, because he is his own fascinating mess. There's a book that I have about him, just who was Jack Ruby, and it is astounding the level of connections that he had with various people. In fact, it's dizzying the number of mob connections, government connections that he had. Fascinating man. But he went in, shoots Oswald in front of the whole world, and then he's in custody, and he makes comments that he can't ever really speak honestly about what his motives were unless he's in a protected place by the Warren Commission. That's what he asks for. That's denied. They come to Dallas, ask him some questions. He kind of stonewalls them and says, no, I need to be in protection if I'm going to answer these questions. I think because he feared for his life. That's my perspective on why he did that. Max Holland is the man I spoke about earlier, who had written the article for the CIA Journal, and he is considered to be one of the people who's like a staunch Oswald lone gunman guy. He says, I did write a journal article for the CIA, and they have a $1,000 award. And so, yeah, I write for a living, and I thought it would be an interesting article, and it turns out it was, because I won the prize. But that's my whole connection with the CIA, he says. We're given a woman named Priscilla Johnson. She spoke Russian, and she actually collaborated with Marina Oswald and wrote a book called Marina and Lee. And she had also, ironically, interviewed Lee Oswald while he was in Russia, way back before he ever came back to America. Max Good sits down with her and asks her if she was a witting collaborator with the CIA. And she initially says, no, I've never worked for the CIA. He shows her documentation where she had actually signed that she was a witting collaborator. And she just does word tricks around this. Witting? Unwitting? Are you saying unwitting? Is it unwilling? Is that what it says? I mean, it's absurd, the level of wordplay she does with those words to try to avoid answering the question. And she says, well, yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that. And very odd. She wrote this book, Marina and Lee, which some of you have suggested that I should review, and perhaps I would at one day. I'm not opposed. I'm very fascinated by the potential of learning more about the relationship between Marina and Lee. However, the fact that it comes through the lips of and through the pen of someone that probably worked for and with the CIA. The CIA, there's quotes from a high up in the CIA saying, we think she could be leaned on to give the perspective that, whatever perspective we want her to have. So very influenceable. So I don't know that she's the woman that I would want to read all about Marina and Lee from. However, she wrote this book, and then he shows her that she applied for the CIA in 1953, and she says, well, you know, I might have, I guess, did it say 1953? I don't know. I'm not sure. I might have. So again, we get this, you know, clouding of the truth when it's there in black and white. It's very plain. Marina's story is that she convinced me to write this book, and so that Marina was willing to. She was 22 in 1963 when the assassination happened, and now she is Marina Oswald Porter, and we're told that she lives in the Dallas area. Max Good walks us through the decades of Marina's interviews, and initially she was asked, did your husband shoot the president? She said, I've seen evidence and they tell me that it's true, and so I believe that it's true, which is a reasonable perspective if you think of a 22-year-old young woman who barely speaks English. So she's come, imagine the life of this young woman. She got married in Russia, has a baby. I mean, any of you who have been postpartum, you know, like flood of hormones and feelings and all of this. She's brought to America, culture shock, whiplash, complete disorientation of language and all the changes around you, a completely different culture. She is living with Lee, attending parties, then going to New Orleans. He's doing his political work. Then Ruth Paine picks her up and they come back here, and now she's living with a totally different woman and seeing her husband like 2 times a week. Supposedly there had been domestic violence between them, that he had hit her once or twice. And I'm not sure how true or not that is in light of all of this. I don't know if that was a cover story to be why they would be separated at this particular time. We do note that Ruth and Michael come back together immediately following the assassination. So was that all a ruse to make it so that Lee was by himself during these times? We don't exactly know what was happening, but from the perspective of Marina, imagine all that whirlwind of change in your life. And then you're at this lady's house, you're with your 2 babies. 2 babies is hard. It's when you feel really overwhelmed as a young mom. You guys know I have a lot of children, but I don't think it ever gets harder than that 1-2 stage of parenting where it's all new, and then you're outnumbered and you have to figure out how to prioritize needs of people that are just both so needy. That's hard. And she's doing all of this in someone else's home where you would feel watched and your actions are constrained by what you're even permitted to do, what resources you have there in that place, what outreach potential you have in that place. Very difficult. And then policemen are there, your husband did it, we're taking you into custody. They told me there's evidence, so I guess I believe that. That totally makes sense from the perspective of a 22-year-old who's just been through everything we just described. Well, now we get a view of her in the 80s and 90s. And she is an older, woman, probably in her 40s at that point. She says, I don't believe any longer that he was the killer. She confirms in 1968, Marina said that the Secret Service told her that Ruth Paine was CIA and that she was to steer clear. This is another piece of evidence mounting for me in the direction of, yes, Ruth Paine was for sure CIA. The Secret Service, who has taken Marina into custody, remember, and they're the ones receiving the book from Ruth, passing the letter back to Ruth, assuming it's her. She passes it back saying, oh no, that was Lee's. It doesn't have Lee or Marina's fingerprints on it. And so the Secret Service is the conduit for that happening. They're the ones guarding Marina. the Secret Service is the one that tells her, Ruth Paine is CIA and you need to steer clear. It's pretty telling. So she says, I didn't pursue seeing her anymore, which fits with them not having met any longer. Well, now in modern day, Max Good reaches out to her and he says, would you be willing to talk? Could we talk about this? And she declines the interview with Max Good. She says, it's too late. The truth will never come out. Don't waste your life on this, which is sad. So now he brings us to the motive side of things. What would be the potential motives to get JFK out of the way and install a different president? What motive would there be on the part of the government? And he points to the Vietnam War. He says in 1963, we had 0 troops. By 1967, we had more than 500,000 in Vietnam. And he points to the public trust in government. He says it was very high in the early 1960s, and it starts to plummet in the mid and late 1960s. By the time the Warren Commission happens, the public trust starts to drop, but especially once the video is seen, you can see the trust in government completely decline, that we were a fairly naive people who believed our government. We believed they were telling us the truth. We believed that they were for our good. We believed that they were mostly doing right. And I would say that fits hand in glove with what we see just 6 years later with the Chappaquiddick incident, that we see people who really want to believe the best about Kennedy. Even despite the evidence of their eyes and ears, they want to believe the best. They want to see that he is honorable. They want to, we're reading through this right now, and it is so good. But what we see is journalists, some who are questioning, but a lot more who are just wanting to believe the best about Ted Kennedy. And that's what we were like as a people. But our cynicism increased and our trust in government decreased after the JFK assassination. He points us to the idea of a national security state. And there's one researcher that points out, if you believe these things, if you believe that there is a hidden history of the United States, that there was a conspiracy to kill one of our presidents, and that the Warren Commission then was a deliberate part of covering up that action, which I think the documentary has made the case for all of those things rather well, certainly for the last 2 pieces of what I just described, then if that is true, it changes your very identity. This longtime JFK researcher says, if you believe these things, you actually have to go from an identity as a citizen of a free country where things happen in the open and we deal with them. We have democratic elections. We elect our presidents. Who we elect is who gets to serve. And we have an honorable government that upholds the rule of law and upholds the will of the people. You have to take your identity from a citizen of a free country to now you are a subject of a militaristic empire. And that's a complicated thought. It's one I've been mulling even more the last week as I rewatched the documentary just the other day, just to refresh myself for this final chat. It's a very complex thing to consider, that if this is true, then what happened really was a military coup. If this is what happened, that Allen Dulles and his underlings, using whatever opportunities he had, are the ones who put the chess pieces in place in order to bring about this terrible conclusion. Again, I want to point out, no one is making the case that Ruth Paine knowingly participated in that end goal, but that she potentially was a babysitter for Marina, or that she and her husband were babysitters for Lee and Marina. And I think that fits with the connections that we've seen. Lee and Michael going to political meetings together. Doesn't make any sense. Lee being in connection with a bunch of anti-communist white Russians who have CIA connections, some of them. Doesn't make any sense. Lee being in New Orleans and yet having somebody in Mexico City acting like him. Doesn't make any sense. Then Ruth Paine, having the connections that she does with the CIA, having some very problematic connections to evidence that's found. Not just the gun. Actually, the gun is the least problematic of all the evidence, but all of the note cards in the garage, the letters that come through her hand, and then the fact that the Secret Service tells Marina, steer clear because she is CIA. When you weigh all of that, you have to say something odd was happening with Ruth Paine. Something odd was happening with Michael and Ruth Paine and their goals in their interactions with Lee and Marina. Max Good concludes with a question: were you surveilling the actions of the radical left? She blinks a few times and says, the radical left? She sits and thinks for a while, and then she gives an incredibly long answer and says, well, that's absolutely news to me. Her denial is where the documentary is left. I think Max Good has done a masterful job of bringing to light a previously uncollected story. Ruth Paine has left her bread trail of actions across the decades, but he brought it all together for us. He presents a clear picture of someone who, whatever you believe was going on, you cannot deny that there are very odd things about Ruth Paine, and it's worth contemplating. What was she doing and why? Why did she have all these connections? And then connect herself with Marina and Lee. It wasn't because she needed to practice her Russian to learn it. She wasn't a Russian learner. She had been a Russian teacher years before this. I think 6 years before this. She had been on staff at a community college, I believe, teaching Russian. She knew Russian. Maybe you're interested in practicing. That's fine. Practice with the white Russians. Why are you getting to know this poor lady and asking her to move in with you at a critical time when you get her husband in a job, etc.? We've seen so much evidence that Ruth Paine has some very, very odd choices that she makes that leave us all needing to think through what we believe. And it does kind of lead us to this place of, if these things are true, then the history that we've been given of lone gunman, did it out of spite, did it because he was a small man, looking for an opportunity to make a big name for himself. If that's not what's true, then something else is true. And that's what we're left to ponder. Once we've made our decision about Ruth Paine and who we believe she is, we're still left to ponder, who are we? What country do we live in? What is our true history? These are important questions. I'd love your thoughts in the comments. Like I said, this is episode 4. We're done with this documentary. I may or may not revisit it. I will tell you, if Max Good would talk with me, I would love to interview him. I think the fact that he spoke directly with her and he did all this evidence would make him a great source of information for us. There's other questions I have, like, did anybody ever verify that Ruth Paine went to a dentist appointment like she said she did on the morning of the assassination? I'd love to know for sure if that was ever verified. Things like that. I'd love to hear what he had to do to kind of get himself prepared for that final interview with her. So if you have any connections to Max Good, or if you want to lean on him, I've already reached out and invited him for an interview. So far, I haven't gotten an acceptance, but if I do, I would add to this playlist with an interview with Max Good. But apart from that, we're done. But I would love to hear your thoughts about this documentary. I'd love to hear your thoughts about Ruth Paine. I'd love to hear your thoughts about Marina and her life, like we walked through today. And then the connection between Mary Bancroft, Alan Dulles' mistress, and Ruth Paine. Very interesting. Lots of things we've discussed here. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you next time. Bye.